Good evening, everyone. I'm Chanel Davis. I'm the Chief Experience Officer here at the Gantt Center. And on behalf of our President and CEO, David Taylor, our Board of Directors, staff, the Gantt would love to welcome you and thank you for joining us for Black Philanthropy Month. Here at the Gantt, every layer of the work we do is infused with preservation and celebration of Black art and culture to inspire, empower, and enlighten all that we encounter. With that being said, it's an honor to host this evening's discussion celebrating Black philanthropy. We were just discussing last night that philanthropy takes on many shapes and is crucial in preserving and celebrating our community. We hope you walk away tonight with a deeper understanding and love for what philanthropy truly is, and that you take action to give back to your community in a way that's true to you. A special thank you to PNC Bank for its generous support of tonight's program. We are grateful for their partnership and commitment to enriching the lives of our communities. I also want to thank New Generation of African American Philanthropists, also known as NGAAP. Thank you all for sharing this experience with us. Specifically, a long-standing partner of the Gantt Center, Ms. Valeda Fullwood. Let's give her a round of applause. As many of you already know, Valeda is a multi-talented author and consultant responsible for countless innovative ideas coming to fruition with the Gantt Center and beyond. We call her the Idea Whisperer. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Valeda Fullwood.
Good evening. I'm so happy to see everybody here tonight. This has been in effect, or at least envisioned, pre-pandemic. So to finally be here in August 2022 with a full house and an author here and our presence at the Gantt Center really makes me happy. The Gantt Center has been a longtime partner of NGAAP. In fact, they were an early investor in our idea around the Giving Back Project and the book that it produced, Giving Back, a tribute to generations of African American philanthropists. So I want to thank the Gantt Center again for their longtime support of our work and vision for this community. I want to share a little bit about NGAAP so we have a full audience and help demystify what our circle is. We are a philanthropic collective. We've been inspiring action through the power of Black philanthropy since 2006. This is our sweet 16 years, so we're celebrating all year. We've been celebrating, yes. It's been a wonderful journey with a family of people. I'll tell you a little bit about us. We share values around culture and having an impact in our community through philanthropy. And we value relationships. We value just being connected and the power of Black philanthropy. This is an image of our giving circle taken by our image activist who's in the room, Alvin Jacobs. This is in celebration of our 15th anniversary. We lead what we call the BOLD Project, which is around Black organizations leading differently. And we want to support and strengthen Black-led, Black-founded nonprofits in our community. Our vision is to pave a new path in philanthropy, to break down barriers, and to elevate the vision and voices of Black leaders in our community for the benefit of our community. So in short, what we do, these three icons sum it up. We make grants, we pool our dollars, our members give essentially $1 a day at a minimum. So our circle is accessible. If you have more to give, you give more. So we have members who, yes, give the $1 a day or $365 a year, but sometimes give $10,000 to our circle in a year to contribute to our grant-making pool, and we award grants to Black-led and Black-founded nonprofits serving our community. In addition to the grant-making, we also convene and connect, which tonight is an example of that. We bring people together to have important conversations. We also lead with our thought leadership. These are some of the ways that we have worked to have an impact over the last 16 years. Through our collective giving, we've been able to attract money and leverage resources, our time, talent, and treasure, upwards of $1.4 million to have an impact here in Charlotte and beyond. We also value collaboration, which our work with the Gantt Center is an example of that. During this month specifically, we've partnered with Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, the Charlotte chapter, Share Charlotte, Q City Metro, and a variety of groups to help lift up the story of Black giving in our community. And then one of the things we're most proud about is we've really helped set the frame, not only in Charlotte, but nationally and globally, about what Black philanthropy is. NGAAP has been a partner in defining and building and shaping Black Philanthropy Month over the last 11 years, and we're super proud of that. And we take serious our role as a pace setter on Black Philanthropy Month. What we do in Charlotte ripples to other communities, and they take note and follow suit. So the first proclamation for Black Philanthropy Month, or at least the second, I mean, the founder had one in Minneapolis. The second one was here in Charlotte, proclaiming every August Black Philanthropy Month. And now I think it's over 40 cities and states and municipalities have now have proclamations for Black Philanthropy Month. And this brings us tonight, which is part of our overall BOLD project work, but specifically our Black Philanthropy Month work, in culminating tonight's conversation with author Tyrone McKinley Freeman. So let me tell you a little about Tyrone. Tyrone McKinley Freeman is an award-winning scholar and teacher who serves as Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies and Director of Undergraduate Programs at the Indiana Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Previously, he was a professional fundraiser for social services, community development, and higher education organizations. He was also Associate Director of the Fundraising School, where he trained nonprofit leaders in the United States, Africa, Asia, and Europe. His research focuses on the history of African American philanthropy, philanthropy in communities of color, and philanthropy and fundraising in higher education. His book, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow, examines African American women's history of charitable giving, activism, education, and social service provision through the life and example of Madam C.J. Walker, the early 20th century Black philanthropist and entrepreneur. Dr. Freeman's work has appeared or been cited in the Oprah magazine, Time, BBC News, Newsweek, News One, Blavity, and a whole host of media outlets. He is co-author of Race, Gender, and Leadership in Nonprofit Development and Nonprofit Organizations, which was published in 2011. He's a proud HBCU grad. Tyrone earned his BA in English and Liberal Arts from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, an MS in Adult Education from Indiana University, a Master's in Urban Regional Planning from Ball State University, and a Ph.D. in Philanthropic Studies from Indiana University. We are so proud to host Dr. Freeman tonight. I also want to be explicit about the fact that this year he was awarded the Dan David Prize, which is an international award to historians. And he received that award in Israel this year. It's kind of like the MacArthur Genius Award for historians. So we're really pleased to have him here tonight. And without further ado, I give you Dr. Tyrone McKinley Freeman.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that, Valeda. Good evening, everyone. Oh, that was pretty bad. We're going to have to do that one again. I didn't come all the way down here from Indiana to celebrate Black Philanthropy Month for that kind of welcome, so let's do that again. Good evening, Charlotte family. Good evening. Oh, there you go. I like that. I like that. That's much better. Thank you. Thank you. First, thank you again for that introduction. I'm honored to be here. I want to begin by giving thanks to the Gantt Center. Thank you for co-sponsoring this and making it possible. This Gantt legacy is very powerful and palpable here, and I'm very honored to be affiliated with it in this manner. And I'm grateful to the hospitality shown to me over the past few days by Carla and Fiera and Chanel and Feeney and everyone I've come into contact with. So thank you very much. I also want to give thanks to the new generation of African-American philanthropists. It is really special for me to be here because I've been following your work for many years and have been really inspired by it. And when I was writing the book, I didn't want it to be for academics. I wanted it to be for the everyday givers who represented this tradition. And so I literally thought about you, and I thought about what you wanted to know, and I thought about what a dream it would be to be able to come to Charlotte and share this work with you. And now it's here. So thank you. Your work ripples far beyond your region, and lots of people are watching you. So again, I'm super excited to be here because of NGAAP. And then that leads to my sister, Valeda. Thank you so much. She contacted me 2 years ago before the book came out and said, you know, we got to get you down to Charlotte, and has been working behind the scenes ever since to make it happen. And so I'm very grateful for that. And Valeda showed an early interest in my work that has just meant the world. So thank you. Thank you. There's another person in the audience I want to recognize who's also played a big role in my being here and also getting the book out. It's interesting, we've been working together very closely for 2 years, but today was the first day that we actually met each other in person. And so I'm very happy that Relisa Tutwiler is here. You stand up for a moment here. Relisa Tutwiler is the CEO and owner of CCM&T Speakers, which is a Black woman-owned boutique speaking firm that represents Black voices and helps us go around the world. And so very honored to have her. She lives in Winston-Salem, and she came over today to be here tonight. So thank you, Relisa. I'm also excited because of my own connections to North Carolina. My father, Reverend William McKinley Freeman, was born in a small town on the coast, Coleraine, North Carolina, near Ahoskie in Bertie County. Some people know it. Okay, all right. I appreciate that. So I spent lots of my summers down here on the family farm with my sister and cousins and my grandparents and great-grandparents. And so just want to take a moment and lift up their names and memories. William McKinley Mitchell and Hattie Anderson Mitchell. You know, Hattie, that's old school Southern, right? My great-grandmother. And David and Ruth Freeman of Coleraine, North Carolina. I literally would not be here without them. So very grateful for that. I'm also indebted to the many great HBCUs in this wonderful state. My father's a graduate of Shaw. My aunt and uncle, Elizabeth City State. My great-grandfather, uncle, and 2 cousins are A&T Aggies. And I have cousins who are North Carolina Central and Fayetteville State. So this legacy is in my blood. And because of them, I wanted to go to an HBCU, and so I did. So again, so many connections that make this somewhat of a homecoming for me. And I'm very, very honored and excited to be here today. Because of NGAAP and because of everything going on here, the Gantt Center, I wanted to do something special for you. And I didn't want to do kind of the normal book talk, which is very good, but wanted to spice it up a little bit for you. And so the title of my talk tonight is If We Had Not Loved Each Other, ... Madam C.J. Walker and the Past, Present, and Future of Black Generosity. Now, there's a lot in this title that I'm going to unpack during our time together this evening. But before we jump in, I want to share with you a little bit about why I wrote this book. And because I didn't write it for academics, as I said, right, I wrote it for the everyday givers who taught me how to give. You see, I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of African-American preachers and first ladies. And this is me as an infant with my mother and father and my grandmother. And so, which means, like many of you, I grew up in the Black church, where I was surrounded by generous people who were constantly giving, caring, and sharing without great fanfare. And never once did I hear them utter the word philanthropy or philanthropist to describe themselves or what they were doing. They were more likely to say they were doing the Lord's will or just doing what you're supposed to do, but they would never, ever dare use a label like that, something as foreign and fancy as philanthropy. You know, 1 month after I professed my faith and was baptized at the age of 11, my father came to me and he said, now, what are you going to do for the church and the community? And I kind of looked at him bewildered and I said, what do you mean? And he said, you're not saved to sit in the pews, you're saved to serve. So what are you going to do for the church and the community? So playtime as a kid in the church was over. I was called to become one of the everyday givers I was surrounded by, contributing to ministry and community and engaging, giving, and investing in others and in the kingdom. And so that's where I learned about Black generosity, from my church, by being an usher, and by benefiting from the tremendous gifts and the many different forms that they take. And so, for example, one of the most powerful and important gifts I ever received came from the black church. Mr. Burns was an elder in my church. He was a tall, slender man, always in his Sunday best, had been through things my young mind couldn't even fathom. But one day after service, he walked up to me, and I was about 15 years old at the time, and he put his hand on my shoulders, and he looked me dead in the eye, and he said, "Tyrone, you could be president of the United States one day if you want to." And then he warmly hugged me, patted me on my back, and then he walked off, and that was it. And, you know, he knew that black youth needed the gift of words, positive words to counteract the evil, negative stereotypes and messages that society gives black kids about who they are. And so that seed he planted in me helped me in ways I can't even begin to explain. Mr. Burns died some years later, but on that famous November night in 2008, I cried a tear of joy and gratitude for Mr. Burns as the Obamas took that stage at Grant Park and ushered in a new era that Mr. Burns and his generation fought for and hoped for, but didn't live to see. So I was raised in and by black generosity, and yet years later, when I entered into the professional world of fundraising, where I was regularly the only African American in the room, I found myself in a field that promoted philanthropic giving, yet it was ignoring and neglecting people of color. And so when I entered into the academy and began working on my Ph.D., and in this picture I'm here with Lilia Bundles, another friend of NGAAP, who is Madam Walker's great-great-granddaughter and an award-winning journalist in her own right. I was in this Ph.D. program, and I was reading the so-called canon of the great theories and theorists of philanthropy, and did not see much written about black people at all. In fact, they wrote a lot about us being recipients of white philanthropy, but they couldn't see us as givers in our own right to save their own lives if they had to. So I wrote this book to fill this gap that exists between my lived experiences, right, of growing up and being born into black generosity, and my professional experiences in the spaces and places of philanthropy that didn't value it and couldn't see it. So what I call Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving is my articulation of her philosophy of philanthropy. That is why she gave, how she gave, what she gave, and perhaps most importantly, the context in which she gave. And one of the significant contexts for her giving is love. I remember many years ago when Valeda first burst onto the national scene, and she wrote very beautifully and poetically about love, right? She wrote about love and philanthropy, and she reminded the field that the Greek root of the word philanthropy is love, and it refers to love of humankind. And this is a powerful reminder, right? The field knew it, but wasn't acting like it knew it. And so the idea of putting love back into philanthropy is important, and something that resonates with the kind of giving that Madam Walker was doing 100 plus years ago. And so that's the love that's in the title of this presentation. If we had not loved each other. Madam C.J. Walker, the past, present, and future of generosity. And so I've taken the title of the presentation from the great writer and activist James Baldwin, from a text you will know, right? The Fire Next Time, published in 1963. And you'll recall in this text that Baldwin presents two letters. One is titled Letter to My Nephew, right, on the 100th anniversary of emancipation. And his nephew was named for him. He was about 15 years old at the time in 1963. And Baldwin describes his nephew as, quote, tough, dark, vulnerable, and moody, like most teenagers are. And in his purpose in writing is to impart the wisdom of generations of Baldwin men to prepare him as a black man living in a white world intent on destroying him. And Baldwin knows that this world is expert in destroying black men. As he reveals in the letter, he's seen it firsthand and he's experienced it himself. And so he wants to challenge his nephew to recognize and understand this and to channel his energies accordingly. And so Baldwin tells young James about his own father, whom he described as having, quote, a terrible life, and about whom he said was defeated long before he died because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what white people said about him, end quote. Then Baldwin moves on to his brother, young James's father, and he tells of how he practically raised his younger brother and watched him grow into a man who, like their father, also became defeated. Baldwin tells young James, quote, I know what the world has done to my brother and how narrowly he has survived it, end quote. Baldwin describes the circumstances of young James's birth as something akin to the horrific and very difficult conditions of 19th century London that Charles Dickens wrote about in his classic novel. But despite these horrible living conditions for Black Americans in the urban ghettos of the 1950s, Baldwin says it gave James's parents and grandparents every reason to regret and be worried about bringing another Black child into this world. But they didn't fret because of the love they had for young James. And this is the beautiful moment in this letter that has inspired this presentation. James writes the following to James as a baby. Quote, "For here you were, big James, named for me. You were a big baby, I was not. But here you were, to be loved. To be loved, baby, hard, at once and forever, to strengthen you against the loveless world. Remember that. I know how black it looks today for you, and it looked bad that day too. We were trembling. We have not stopped trembling yet. But if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you, and for the sake of your children and your children's children." Oh, I love this paragraph because to me it perfectly and beautifully summarizes the history of Black generosity. In a nod to the kind of love that Valletta reminded us is supposed to be the basis for philanthropy, Baldwin describes how the love of a Black family for their precious newborn baby overcame their very rational fear of white supremacy. And further, how the love that Black people have for freedom and for each other is essential to our survival and points the way forward to our true liberation. It's a beautiful moment, and 6 decades later, it speaks volumes to us now as we wrap up our celebration of Black Philanthropy Month and continue the struggle forward. You see, I'm convinced that the love that Baldwin writes about is the same love that has sustained and energized Black philanthropy from the beginning. Say it with me. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. This love is everything and is at the core of our generosity. It's the reason we've historically given to each other and for each other. And as I have studied the history of African American philanthropy, I have concluded that the history of African American philanthropy, in part, has been the search for hospitality in a land of hostility. I'm going to say that again. I've concluded that the history of African American philanthropy, in part, has been the search for hospitality in a land of hostility. The United States has been a land of obstacles and opportunities for African Americans, where far more of the former have been provided over the latter. However, whether dealing with obstacles or opportunities, African Americans gave their way through this history. To show you, I'm going to take you back to the turn of the 20th century, after emancipation from slavery, after Reconstruction, with a little help from W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1909, Du Bois wrote this: "Few races are more instinctively philanthropic than the Negro. It is shown in everyday life and in their group history. Some few of their philanthropies in early days have been recorded." Now, I know the year 1909, philanthropy and Black people are not 3 things that are normally associated with each other, right? History books and conventional wisdom tend to portray African Americans, as I said earlier, and other people of color as the recipients of white philanthropy, but never as givers or agents of generosity themselves. But here's our dear brother making this claim, and get this, a national study on Black philanthropy that he conducted and published in 1909. And let's remember the context for this study. 1909 is 4 decades removed from emancipation from slavery, when 4 million people stepped out of slavery and into freedom. It's 3 decades removed from the end of Reconstruction, that short period in history where African Americans were free for the first time and beginning to enjoy the rights afforded by the Constitution. But after only 12 years, angry white Southerners resented Black freedom and wanted their country back. They ended Reconstruction and left behind what would become Jim Crow segregation in its wake. It's 1 decade removed from the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision that codified Jim Crow as the law of the land. And in this context, Du Bois wrote, "Few races are more instinctively philanthropic than the Negro." In his report, he paints a very robust philanthropic landscape of Black-led, Black-founded, Black-funded organizations going back several decades into the 1800s. He provides lists of Black philanthropists going back to the 1700s. From churches and fraternal orders, literary societies, to women's clubs, orphanages, old folks schools, and old folks homes and schools, Du Bois documents thousands of black organizations and black people desperately trying to uplift their race in the face of unrelenting hostility, terror, and hatred, all sanctioned by United States public policy and undergirded by American law enforcement and vigilantism. According to Du Bois, African Americans responded to these obstacles and opportunities by giving, engaging, and building their own institutions. And remember, Du Bois is no casual observer. He's a scientist, a sociologist, a historian, the first black Ph.D. to graduate from Harvard. The brother was bad. But as bad as he was still behind the curve because the sisters had already worked it out. Black women were already on top of it, as is often the case according to my wife. In 1894, this black woman, Gertrude Moselle, a journalist and activist based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, wrote this statement in an essay called The Work of the Afro-American Woman. Perhaps the effort that is most unique and yet entirely consistent with the character of the race has been done along the line of philanthropic work. She makes claims for black people as philanthropists in 1894. 15 years before Du Bois, Moselle works it out. In her essay, she paints a robust picture of a landscape dominated by generous black women from the working class to the wealthy. She specifically names as philanthropists black women who were teachers and factory workers, journalists, artists, orators, club women. It didn't matter how they made their livelihood, they were all philanthropists according to Moselle. Why? Because in African American philanthropy, it's not about money. It's about what are you contributing to the long and ongoing struggle for freedom. Your time, your talent, your treasure, your testimony, and your ties or networks or influences. In fact, Moselle names the great black journalist Ida B. Wells as the quintessential philanthropist of any race. Why? Not because of her largesse, but because of the ways in which she used her pen and her voice to document the terror of lynching and force the nation to deal with this evil scourge. In fact, the reason why we know so much about the continual lynching of black people by white vigilantes and law enforcement to this day is because Ida B. Wells was so diligent in meticulously documenting every lynching that she could find. Her gift keeps on giving. And so Du Bois and Moselle help us understand important dimensions of the pervasiveness of black generosity and the robustness of black philanthropic engagement over 100 years ago. There's a long history of African American engagement that included institution building, volunteering, fundraising, giving, activism, and a range of philanthropic behaviors and activities. This giving and the love that exists underneath and within it has been an active agent in our history from the beginning. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. This love is also the context for Madam Walker's story. She was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 on a cotton plantation in Delta, Louisiana. Her parents and 4 siblings had been enslaved, but she was the first freeborn child into that family. But life quickly turned tragic. Her parents died by the time she was 7. She was under the care of her older sister when she began working as a washerwoman in her preteens. She married in her early teens, had a child at 18, and then tragedy struck again. Her husband died suddenly. Now she was a widowed young mother. She was uneducated because there were no provisions for black schooling in this evolving Jim Crow America. Reconstruction had been terminated, and Jim Crow was being constructed all around her. She was a poor, struggling young black woman in the midst of these circumstances. And all of these things happened to her before she became 21 years old. It was a devastatingly difficult early life for young Sarah. But the story begins to turn when she goes to St. Louis in her early 20s in the 1890s. Her brothers ran a barbershop in St. Louis, and she connected with a local church, the St. Paul's African Methodist Episcopal Church, which still exists to this day in St. Louis. The women of that church embraced young Sarah. They mentored her, they supported her, and pretty soon she was serving in ministry and community work. She became a giver just like the women around her. She began working in beauty culture thanks to another black woman named Annie Malone, who owned a company. And eventually she developed her own products, married a man named Charles Joseph Walker, which is where the CJ comes from. She put her own name and face on the products, Madam CJ Walker, and began selling them door to door. In 1910, she moved to Indianapolis, where she built the factory and established the headquarters for the company. And the rest, as they say, is history. She became a household name and generated incredible wealth for the times. Her story culminates in 1916 on her deathbed in this 34-room, $250,000 mansion in Irvington, New York, where a nearby neighbor was Mr. John D. Rockefeller. My friends, that's not supposed to happen. That's not Jim Crow's plan for black life. But she did it anyway. She did it anyway. And it turns out that her philanthropy did not begin in the big mansion after she had made it. No, it began much earlier when young Sarah was a poor, orphan, widowed young mother in St. Louis who was in just as much need as the others she was helping. That's the story I wanted to track down and tell in the book, so I began the research. And so Madam Walker's papers are at the Indiana Historical Society. And there are other important collections that I visited around the country. There's over 200 boxes in Madam Walker's collection. Now they're all digitized, but I had to go through them by hand. And as I was going through them, I needed a lens through which to understand what I was seeing. And so I began to read and study more deeply the history of philanthropy. And I read the literature on the history of American philanthropy, looking for Madam C.J. Walker. And guess what, my friends? She's not there. These historians are very much focused on the wealthy white men who made untold millions and then set up foundations that changed the way that philanthropy operated in America. So it was no help. So then I went to the history of women's philanthropy, looking for Madam C.J. Walker. And guess what? She's not there. These historians centered the wives, daughters, and sisters of the wealthy white men who made untold millions and then created foundations that changed the way philanthropy operated in America. So it was no help. So I said, well, surely if these two fields didn't nail it, then the small but growing literature on African-American philanthropy must. But guess what? She's not there. Well, she is now because of my book, but. These writers tend to focus less on individuals and more on the institutions of black philanthropy. So the church, fraternal orders, women's clubs, right? So it wasn't perfect, but it began pointing me in the right direction, right? But when I got to black women's history, things changed. Black women's historians have been writing about Madam Walker and black women as serious agents of history for decades. And although they weren't writing much about her philanthropy, their work was essential in helping me construct the appropriate lenses for engaging Walker's philanthropic life. Like I said before, the sisters had already worked it out. That's why I always lift up black women's historians and their hashtags Cite a Sister and Cite Black Women, because my work would not exist without them. With this background, I returned to the archive to examine Madam Walker's philanthropy, seeking to articulate her philosophy of giving, and I found my moment in the archives in 1914. In 1914, Walker exchanged a series of letters with Booker T. Washington, the prominent and controversial leader and founder of Tuskegee. She loved what he was doing at Tuskegee, and she wanted to support his work. So she began talking with him about making a scholarship gift of $300. And get this, at the time it would have supported 5 students at Tuskegee and still have $50 left over for the general fund. Those days are gone. And just as they were finalizing this gift, Washington did something that's very common today. He tried to upgrade Madam Walker. He said, well, $300 is nice, but could you do more? Why did he do that? What seemed like a simple upgrade to Washington turned out to be a great insult to Madam Walker. She experienced this as a rejection of her hard-earned money and her deep desire to support Tuskegee. And so she sat down and proceeded to write him a letter in which she thoroughly told him about himself. She wrote, why are you changing your tune? We've been talking about this for weeks, and you said $300 would be helpful. Have I missed my mark? I want to be helpful to you. I want to give you thousands of dollars, but right now, I can only give you hundreds. Work with me here. Then she hits him with this. I am unlike your white friends who have waited until they were rich and then help, but have, in proportion to my success, I am reaching out and am helping others. When I saw that, I smiled. I had found what I was looking for. So let's unpack that a little bit. Let's unpack that. Who were Washington's white friends? Well, for starters, there's Andrew Carnegie, the famous millionaire who's known for that model of philanthropy where you spend your life accumulating wealth and then later in old age turn to philanthropy and start giving it away, right? And Walker's saying to Washington, I'm not a black Carnegie. I'm not waiting. I'm giving along the way. I'm doing what I can now with what I have, and I need you to value and understand that. There's also Olivia Sage, a leading white woman philanthropist of this era based in New York. She was married to the Wall Street financier Russell Sage, and in keeping with the Victorian mores of the era, as a woman, she was not able to lead the kind of publicly engaged life outside of the home that she really wanted to. But after she died, she inherited millions from him, and she was known as a woman of leisure, or as they said, a kept woman at the time. She inherited this money. She set up the Russell Sage Foundation, which still exists to this day. She began making a series of philanthropic gifts, opened up universities for women, funded the environment, helped to start new fields like social work, some consequential gifts. But here's Walker saying to Washington, I'm not a black Olivia Sage. I'm not a kept woman. I'm keeping myself. Okay? I don't have anyone to inherit money from. I've been working in the economy since I was 11 years old. I'm actively creating the resources that I'm giving away to these different causes. I need you to value and understand that. Don't come at me the same way you come at them. See me on my own terms. And so, my friends, if the leading white models of philanthropy at this time don't explain Madam Walker, where exactly did her philanthropy come from? The answer, other black women. Madam C.J. Walker, the entrepreneur, activist, and philanthropist, was produced by the love she experienced from the networks of generous black women, including washerwomen, church women, club women, and fraternal women, and even the Walker sales agents. So let's examine each one quickly. The first network is generous black women, or black washerwomen. Recall that I said Walker began working as a washerwoman in her preteens, and she continued well into her adult life. After emancipation, it turns out that black washerwomen were not just menial laborers at the bottom of the Southern economy. No, they were entrepreneurs and activists in their own right. They were very generous and very engaged. In fact, Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Month, wrote that black washerwomen during this time period were very philanthropic and were among the first people that black organizations would go to for donations. They not only paid for their families' housing and education, but they also helped to incubate black businesses. They regularly engaged in mutual aid practices, watching each other's children, washing even their clients' clothing together to get some economies of scale going, sharing food and other resources. And in places like Atlanta, Georgia, and Galveston, Texas, according to Princeton University historian Tara Hunter, they organized themselves into washing societies where they organized and protested to protect their labor and their wages. It turns out that unfortunately many of their white clients would stiff them on payday. And even though they would return their laundry to them crisp and clean and fresh and ready to go, they wouldn't pay them. So in these cities, the washing societies protested, and they were successful in getting local city governments to protect their wages and outlaw this kind of not paying them. So again, very philanthropic, very, very powerful and engaged women. And Madam Walker was very proud of having been a washerwoman. And when we stop and think about Osceola McCarthy, the black washerwoman who made that six-figure gift to Ole Miss back in the 1990s, we can see that this tradition continues. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. The next, we have black church women and black club women. I mentioned before when young Sarah arrived in St. Louis, she connected with St. Paul's African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is a picture of the church. And considering the harsh treatment that black people were experiencing in St. Louis, St. Paul's created and funded its own black philanthropic social safety net to meet the community's needs and to demonstrate this love for black people. It included an orphanage and an old folks' home. They provided housing for black migrants and schooling for black children. And this woman, Jessie Batts Robinson, was a leader at the church and was at the center of this safety net. She was also part of the National Association of Colored Women, which was building schools, running programs, and advocating for policy changes to aid black communities around the country. She took young Sarah under her wing, and Jessie became a very dear friend and later would work at the Walker Company. She's one of the many women at the church who embraced and loved Sarah and taught her to give and to protest and to fight. And in reflecting on her time in St. Louis, Madam Walker and Elder Madam Walker said it was in St. Louis that she learned it was truly her mission to relieve the poor and distressed according as she was able. And generous, loving black women like Jessie are a big part of that story. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. The next generous network of black women that gave rise to Madam Walker was fraternal women. Jessie was the national head of a fraternal order called the Court of Calanthe. And it turns out that the Court of Calanthe believed in Christian charity and practiced it regularly. She brought young Sarah into this fraternal order. They have 3 ritual levels of degrees that members achieve by doing community service projects. Madam Walker earned all 3. They regularly pay dues into a fund and then use that money to pay social insurance, burial insurance, and to provide other forms of relief to Black people in Black communities. Sound familiar? This type of pooling of resources was commonplace in our community back then and is the historical predecessor of today's giving circles like NGAAP. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. The last network of generous Black women were Walker Company sales agents. In 1916, Walker began organizing her agents into Walker clubs, and she told them it wasn't enough for them to be selling these products in their different regions. They had to be doing something for the good of the race too. And I was able to find about 50 of these clubs spread across the country. There are various reports and letters in the archive where they're reporting back to Walker how they took that charge seriously. They donated money to the NAACP, donated furniture to Black colleges, conducted fundraising events for local organizations, participated in protest marches. And in 1917, Walker convened the Walker clubs at a national conference at a church in Philadelphia. This is a picture from that scene, where they wrote, signed, and sent a resolution to President Woodrow Wilson condemning the American practice of lynching and demanding protections for Black life. And by the way, back in March of this year, President Biden signed the first and only federal anti-lynching bill into law. This was the same law that Walker and her agents fought for but didn't live to see. If we had not loved each other. My friends, these are the origins and evolutions of Madam Walker's philanthropy. She's one of our philanthropic foremothers, but it's not her story alone. It's our story. It's our history of our collective tradition of giving, caring, and sharing, and of the love that has sustained us back then and sustains us now. And when we understand this, we not only understand Madam Walker better, we understand ourselves and our giving today better. We understand Oprah Winfrey. I argue it would be a mistake to think of her as a Black Carnegie or a Black Sage. She has attributed her engagement with philanthropy and education and literacy back to her grandmother, who was a Mississippi churchwoman and clubwoman in this Walker tradition. But Ms. Winfrey is in a class all by herself, right? And our giving is not only about the elite, right? But it's about the everyday givers like my mother, Carolyn Cooper Freeman, First Lady of Union Baptist Church in Orange, New Jersey. Generous to the core, not a millionaire by any stretch of imagination, but a churchwoman, a clubwoman who's been very engaged from the beginning. It's about NGAAP and the love you're demonstrating for Charlotte by pooling your resources, taking public stands, and pursuing justice, right, and liberation. You're elevating this same collective giving tradition that sustained our ancestors and that made a way for us to be here today. It's about the Young Black and Giving Back Institute in Washington, D.C., a Black millennial manifestation of this tradition where Ebony Cooper Jean and a team of young Black philanthropists are challenging and showing their generation how to plug into this tradition. It's about the Divine Nine historic Black Greek letter fraternities and sororities, who each have their own unique histories of philanthropy and represent this tradition. From the AKA setting up endowments at every single HBCU to the Q-Dogs partnership with the Alzheimer's Association, every single member of the Divine Nine has a national philanthropic agenda providing important gifts and resources to our communities. It's about the Me Too movement, started by our sister Tarana Burke, in this grand tradition of Walker's activism on behalf of Black women. Walker was on the front lines of the fight for women's voting rights, and today we see Black women leading the way to the polls and on issues of political and economic empowerment. Similarly, it's no accident that Black Lives Matter was founded by 3 Black women coming out of this tradition. Madam Walker and her agents were on the front lines of the anti-lynching movement 100 years ago, demanding protections for Black life from brutality and racial terror. This legacy of activism and engagement continues in the protests of the pandemic and the ongoing community work they're doing, addressing issues of policing, housing, education, and healthcare. And of course, it's no accident that Black Philanthropy Month, created and advanced by Black women. But let me pause for a minute, because I think I hear some brothers in the room saying, wait a minute, Dr. Freeman. Thank you for lifting up our dear sisters, but what about us? We did some stuff too. Yes, we did, my dear brothers, but for that, you're going to have to wait for the next book. The next book is all about Black men's giving, and I'm going to hit you with some James Forten from the 1700s and Tommy LaFon from the 1800s and Colonel John McKee from the 1900s and many others. So you're going to have to bring me back But tonight belongs to the sisters who embody this generosity and this love to their core. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. Our great philanthropic past reveals the truth about us. And this great history is active in our present through our giving today. But what about the future of Black generosity? Well, as we come to a close, this history of giving and generosity that Du Bois, Moselle, and Walker have shown us gives us important clues about our collective future. In fact, one of the gifts of African American philanthropy is that it takes the long view on questions of liberation and justice. It seeks short-term wins, but it never takes its eyes off the long-term prize. We know that racial justice and gender equity are not short-term propositions. It took 400 plus years to get into this mess. Lord knows how long it'll take to get out. But throughout our history of giving, freedom has been elusive for us. But we never gave up. We persisted because freedom is worth it. Our ancestors persisted, our giving persisted, and now so must we. A wonderful example of this persistence, taking the long view, is represented in this picture from 1952. It's taken at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, at the gravesite of Madam C.J. Walker. You can see her headstone there in the corner. Standing around the gravesite were hundreds of Black beauticians who had come from as far away as Oregon to honor Madam Walker as a trailblazer of their profession and to induct her and Annie Malone and another Black woman named Sarah Spencer Washington into the Beauticians Hall of Fame. And this picture captures a very powerful moment in the ceremony, the memorial service held that day. The man in the dark suit with his hands folded in the front is Walter White, the national head of the NAACP. And according to the newspaper, in his comments, he said that the NAACP would not have survived the Great Depression were it not for the generosity of Madam C.J. Walker. Think about this for a moment. It's 1952. And the head of the NAACP says the NAACP would not have survived the Great Depression from the 1930s without Madam Walker's gifts. A little background. During her lifetime, Madam Walker gave money to the NAACP and volunteered her time. She participated in their protest marches. She even supported its national campaign against lynching with a deathbed gift of $5,000, literally before her last breath. She also made charitable provisions in her estate for the NAACP, including the donation of proceeds from the sale of her 34-room mansion in New York after her death, right? And so 33 years after her death, Walter White stood next to her grave and essentially said, we wouldn't be here if Madam Walker hadn't given. That's a powerful and historically significant statement because in 1952, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP's legal team were just beginning the early proceedings of what would become the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that desegregated schools across the land. 2 years before that win, Walter White says we wouldn't be here if Madam Walker hadn't given. It's 3 years before Rosa Parks stood up by sitting down to launch the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. And here's Walter White saying we wouldn't be here if Madam hadn't given. 1952 is 3 years before the world has heard of a young, vibrant preacher named Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Walter White is saying we wouldn't be here if Madam hadn't given. In fact, he's not even doctor yet. He's still at Boston University working on his Ph.D. He has not even met Coretta Scott yet, and Walter White says we wouldn't be here if Madam hadn't given. Madam Walker fought Jim Crow, segregation all of her life. She wanted Jim Crow to die during her lifetime, but it didn't. But she took the long view. She took the love that she had for her people, and she cast it forward through giving. 33 years later, because she and others gave, a victory came and set in motion a slew of other victories as more soldiers like Walter White and Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King Jr. took up the baton and kept giving and kept going. Surely Madam Walker didn't know what her gift would do, but she had hope. And that same hope and persistence is what we need to make the changes we desire for an increasingly diverse America and global world. Which brings us back to Baldwin. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. This love is at the core of our hope. It's at the core of our generosity. And indeed, we can draw strength from the hope of generosity as we fight the good fight today and cast our love and our fight forward through giving. In fact, as I write at the end of the book, generosity is ultimately a form of hope. We give as an expression of the possibilities to which we aspire and that we want to make real. We give not only because the need is so overwhelmingly great, but in spite of its greatness. We are not deterred, though we might be daunted. Our gifts represent the possibility of a different tomorrow. The hope wrapped up in each gift, no matter its size, is the hope of Daniel against Goliath. Over time, when our hope is merged with the hope of others through giving, mountains are moved and rivers are reversed. A gift by an African American during Jim Crow was an act of resistance and hope, an expression of dignity, and a signal that no matter the conditions, as long as one could give, the human soul would not be crushed. My friends, that's our history, that's our present, and that's our future. Because if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Right here. My name is Adrienne Threed. I'm one of the founders of Hope Vibes, a local nonprofit here in the city. And my question is related to the comments that you made about the role of the church in us all being born and raised in a culture of generosity. And I'm sorry I'm out of breath. I have triplets inside of me. With the shift of how church is seen in our day and age, especially among younger people, with a lot of the, deconstruction and even just a lot of the things that people are doing who are in leadership, they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and so it skews the perspective of who the church is and the role that they should play in our society. Do you think that that is stripping away the church's position in philanthropy, even in the sense that whereas our grandmothers, our parents, our great-grandparents, they were all in church and they took us to church, we didn't have a choice, but now we have generations of people who are separating from the church, which means that there are generations coming after that who are not in the church. What role do you think that that plays in the shift of the church in philanthropy?
Yeah, thank you. Great question, and congratulations, you and your family. No, it's an important question. And it's interesting because for African Americans still overwhelmingly identify as Christian. There's also a very strong Islamic population amongst African Americans. And even as, so for the past 50 years, there's been a decline in religious membership across races and denominations. But African American membership was holding strong, but it's beginning to dip. And the Pew Research Center did a study recently and noted some of the emerging religious practices of younger African Americans in particular. And some of them are looking to African traditions and other things that elders in the church wouldn't be excited about, right? But that they are finding resonance with. So it does speak to this issue because the Black church was our space, and it's where we regularly teach giving, right? Every time you enter into the house, you're supposed to leave something behind, and from passing the plates, and even people have made rituals out of online giving. So it begs the question of how will we demonstrate and teach and practice this giving on a regular basis? And so this is why groups like NGAAP are very important, although I know many of your members are very much faith-filled and inspired by that work. So it'll be interesting to see. A lot of researchers are looking at this question. If people are moving away from religion, where will they go to get those kinds of things? Because we also know from a standpoint of philanthropy that people who identify as religious give more philanthropically than people who do not. They volunteer more. So it has these other connections too that our sector is very concerned with. So it's a big question. We don't know the answer yet in terms of what the ultimate impact will be, but you're right. This decline, it will have a big impact. And to help you also see this, it used to be 50 years ago when we first started tracking how much money Americans give to charity, the largest portion, half, went to religion, mainly congregations. Now it's less than a third. Less than a third goes to congregations and religious organizations. So that speaks to, again, there's a big trend in American society of moving away from institutional religion. So a lot of us are wondering about what will people use or create to address that. But that said, the lingering tradition of the Black church is still very powerful and still very important. It's, like I said, it's animating many of you here tonight. And every generation has to kind of navigate and figure out their relationship with higher power. So we'll see again what the millennials ultimately do with this. But there also is that Pew showed that some are also still identifying with it. So the short is I don't know what the bigger implication is, but we're tracking it and we're trying to monitor it. Yes.
Alvin Jacobs. Many of us have been programmed to wait until we get some money. Soon as I hit the lottery, soon as I get that bag, I'm gonna give. I don't have it right now, but I'm gonna give it when I get it. I found it incredibly powerful that she was giving all along. The dollar per day, $365 a year. I had no idea those were the increments, right? Because I'm thinking, I don't have it, right? Well, if I don't have it, that means you don't either. And if you don't have it, that means we can't get it. We're waiting until we get a whole bunch. But even biblically, spiritually, it's what are you doing with the little, right? Like we're waiting for individuals to save our community. It's not going to happen. Until we start taking care of ourselves, we're going to continue being preyed on in our community because it's always, well, they don't take care of it, so they don't need it. They're not keeping it up. Look at real estate. Look at gentrification. It's being taken away from us because we aren't, quote unquote, taking care of. We aren't being good stewards over the little of what we have. So I appreciate that, brother. That was powerful. I literally thought when she got that bag, she started giving. But she made it a point. No, I'm not like these other white philanthropists. I'm giving it all along. Don't try to play me. Put some respect on my name.
That's right. Yeah, thank you for that. And I articulate her philosophy of giving, the gospel of giving as give as you can to be helpful to others. Spare no useful means that will be helpful to others. And as your means increase, give more.
Good evening. I'm Shannon Walker with Carolina Raptor Center. Thank you so much for being here. I, too, was moved by the same segment that you were, my brother. And I just wondered if you could speak to how she said to him, you can't come at me like you would another donor. And how do we apply that, especially if you're in the field of fundraising? It's not a cookie cutter approach, right, when you're making an ask. But what could you offer to us as we in this field hope to engage Black donors? And can we approach them in a way that is different and that speaks to them, knowing that we can't come at them like we would our white donors?
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that, and I do a lot of work with fundraisers on this issue. So there's a few things. So one in the book I do a case example of the Smithsonian's campaign for the National Museum of African American History. And I know NGAAP member Anna Barber. She was one of my sources. I so appreciate she's a good friend. Really taking Black donors and Black givers seriously is something that the sector needs to do. It hasn't been doing it. And I tell fundraisers that all the time. And it also means going to where the givers are and not always waiting for them to come to you. And it doesn't matter if you're a university or a social service agency or an arts center, right? Go to where the people are. I point out that's what the Smithsonian, that's what Anna and her colleagues did. It's the Smithsonian. Like, it's not a warm, fuzzy Black organization. Right? It's in DC and all that, right? But they went to where we were and we showed up and showed out. But there was care there. There was kind of continuing to show up, realizing years of hurt, years of neglect, realizing the harm that's been done and how you have to keep showing up and listen. And you might have to do a lot to gain that trust before you earn the right to ask them. That's the work that organizations have to do. Right? What's the reason for this disconnect? What's the reason you're not thinking? Because fundraisers have a lot of control of their day. Fundraisers determine who gets a letter, who gets an invitation, who gets a phone call, who gets a visit. Why aren't Black people on your list? Right? So this is something that organizations have to work on. And on the other side, right, it's important for Black givers and donors of color to embrace their history and their heritage and to draw strength from it as they continue to engage the work today. So I definitely think fundraisers need to do a better job of valuing and respecting these traditions and connecting with our communities. Yeah. Oh,
Got a quick
the
question.
mic is moving its way around. We'll get over there.
I'm going to answer Adrian's question about what we can do with young people and inspire them to give. And then I want to ask you if you talk about this in the book. But I do believe that outside of church, including church, but outside of church, that it's going to be important that we have sacred spaces that people can come around to have authentic conversation and deep conversation about what it looks like to give in those circles collectively. So the barbershops, I'm wondering if you talk about the barbershops or the beauticians, the tea bars. Shameless plug here. Setting up spaces where people can be real, where people can be authentic, where people can talk about giving from a way that is holistic. I think that's where we're looking with this younger generation. They're looking for out-of-the-box, innovative ways to support one another.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit earlier at the Lunch and Learn, but we do research on how do you teach generosity, how do you teach philanthropy to young people? And the research is fairly simple. It's not this big grand thing. The idea is for parents, talk to your kids about what you're doing. All too often we're just doing it, but not explaining it. So as you write that check or make that transaction online, take a moment and tell your young person why you're doing it, what's it going to and how it's helpful and why it's important. If you're going off to that board meeting, don't just kind of leave the house, right? Take a moment and saying, I'm on this board, I give my time, and this is why I do it, and here's what this organization is about. That's what the research shows helps to inculcate this into young people. And we have this we do this panel study where for the past 60 years, they've been tracking the same set of families and their subsequent generations and asking them the same set of questions every 2 years. And so we have, going back, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. And so we've asked questions about philanthropy. And we can see these philanthropic behaviors show up in the subsequent generations from the people who were actively talking to their young people versus those who weren't. So that's an important add-on to this and relates to your idea of creating these spaces to talk about these things. I think there's a connection there to doing this for adults. Right? And making this connection to philanthropy that we are a part of this tradition. Philanthropy is a collective human phenomenon. It is not a wealthy white phenomenon. It is something that belongs to all of us. And there'll be different approaches or ways of thinking about it. There might even be different language to refer to it, but the bottom line is we all do it. And so really creating those, I'm totally with you on that, creating those spaces to celebrate that and to honor that and to support people and help usher people in. Remember, Madam Walker was an orphan. She didn't have parents to teach her, but the women did. The women taught her this, right? The women brought her into it. So when you see Madam Walker's giving, I want you to see that woman. I want you to see Jessie because she's modeling Jessie. And then she puts her own spin on it, as you said, as the young people will do, right? So you model it for the young people, and then they'll put their own spin on it through TikTok and everything else that they're doing, right? I think there was a question over here.
Good evening. John Reeves, Sigmas of Charlotte Foundation. Again, I was just spellbound by your presentation. Thank you for what you do. My question is a little bit different. One of the things that we knew about Madam C.J. Walker is that she was a giver, but she also was an investor. So could you talk a little bit more about giving as well as investing? Because oftentimes when people are in I call it the giving game, they don't really talk about the aspect of investing the money so that it can grow. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how, particularly in our community, we obviously don't have a lot of the tools that some of our contemporaries have to do that, but it'd be really fun to hear your perspective on that.
Sure, thank you. So Madam Walker, one of the things I talk about in the book is how she used her company as a base for a lot of this work. And so today we have terms like social entrepreneurship and all these kinds of ways that people think about this work. But she was doing this before it was kind of a B-school trend, right? And she was very intentional. She thought about the company as a race company, meaning by us, for us, the original FUBU, right? And she saw it as a base for building economic power. And also creating these economic pathways for black women, because Jim Crow didn't want them to be able to take care of their families, right? Didn't want them to be successful. But she showed them how to do that, and she showed them their responsibility, right, to engage in the struggle. So it's important to understand that. She also would give them money to help launch and incubate their salons. So she had this program, she'd give you some money, and I tell some of the stories of some of the women who renovated storefronts or did these kind of things, started hanging their shingle, and became breadwinners for their family. And a lot of people don't know this, but A. Philip Randolph's wife went to Walker School and owned a beauty salon in Harlem. She was a Walker agent, right? And A. Philip Randolph, the great black labor leader, said he wouldn't have been able to do the work in the community, this activism, if his wife wasn't holding the family down. There you go, right? There you go. So all that part is very important. And so today, whether the language of social impact, social investing, there's a move to try to get people to think differently, to think beyond. For people who might not be interested in a notion of charity, but thinking about how can you make investments in the community and what might the return be? The return would be something that benefits all of us. The return might be the young people that get to go to college but couldn't before, or that have the elders who have access to health care that didn't before. And there's really some very, very interesting and exciting things going on. I'm part of a group that's looking at some of these bigger issues, and there's a lot of new tech companies and B Corps and new types of firms that are coming up where people are intentionally thinking about the financial bottom line that businesses must think about, but also the more social bottom lines in terms of impact on the community, impact on the environment, and impact on issues of equity and justice. And so people are thinking about how to encourage others to give more. People are thinking about how to leverage these gifts to make large-scale investments into communities and help to whatever that needle is to push people over so that communities can have housing and education that they need. So there is a philosophy out there about social impact investing and using your gifts in that way for some people who connect to that approach.